David Martinez had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he owned 3 luxury car dealerships across the city, lived in a mansion overlooking the harbor, and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Success had hardened him, made him forget the hungry nights of his childhood when his mother would skip meals so he could eat. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue as David walked briskly toward the bank, his 8-year-old son Tommy's small hand clasped firmly in his own. They were heading to open Tommy's first savings account, a tradition David wanted to start early. The boy needed to understand the value of money, the importance of financial responsibility. "Papa, why are we walking so fast?" Tommy asked, his little legs struggling to keep pace with his father's determined stride. "Time is money, son," David replied without slowing down. "Every minute we waste is $1 we don't earn." As they approached the marble steps of First National Bank, David's phone buzzed. Another deal closing, another opportunity presenting itself. He was already mentally calculating profits when Tommy suddenly tugged on his sleeve. "Papa, look," the boy whispered, pointing toward the corner where the bank's imposing structure met the old brownstone next door. There, huddled against the cold brick wall, sat a figure wrapped in tattered layers of clothing. The person's face was hidden beneath a worn baseball cap, and a cardboard sign rested against their knees, though the words were too faded to read from a distance. A small paper cup sat hopefully on the sidewalk, containing only a few coins that caught the morning light. David barely glanced in that direction. He had seen countless homeless people in the city, and, while he occasionally dropped change into collection boxes at charity events, he had no time for individual cases. There were systems in place for these situations, shelters and programs. It wasn't his responsibility to solve every person's problems on the street. "Come on, Tommy," he said, steering his son toward the bank's entrance. "We have business to attend to." But Tommy's feet seemed rooted to the spot. The boy stared at the huddled figure with an intensity that made David uncomfortable. There was something in his son's expression, a recognition that David couldn't understand. "Tommy, now," David commanded, his voice carrying the authority that made employees jump and competitors nervous. Still, the boy hesitated. His small face scrunched up in concentration, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle that adults couldn't see. David felt his patience wearing thin. He had an appointment in 15 minutes, and the morning traffic would only get worse. "Son, we need to go inside. The bank manager is expecting us." Tommy took a reluctant step toward the bank but kept looking back over his shoulder. The homeless person hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged their presence. David wondered briefly what could be so fascinating to an 8-year-old about someone who had clearly made poor life choices. The interior of the bank was all polished marble and gleaming brass, the kind of opulence that David had worked 20 years to access freely. The cool air conditioning provided relief from the morning heat, and the quiet hum of efficient business soothed his nerves. This was his world now, far removed from the chaos of the streets outside. Margaret Chen, the account manager, greeted them with professional warmth. She had prepared all the paperwork for Tommy's savings account, and David appreciated her efficiency. As they settled into her office, David began explaining to Tommy the importance of saving money, of making smart financial decisions from an early age. "Money doesn't grow on trees," David told his son as Margaret prepared the documents. "Every dollar you save today will be worth more tomorrow if you invest it wisely." Tommy nodded dutifully, but David noticed the boy kept glancing toward the window that faced the street. Even from the second floor, they could see the corner where the homeless person sat. David found his son's distraction irritating. "Tommy, are you listening to me?" David asked, his voice sharper than intended. "Yes, Papa," Tommy replied quickly, but his eyes returned to the window almost immediately. Margaret noticed the tension and smoothly redirected their attention to the paperwork. She explained how the savings account would work, how Tommy could deposit his allowance and birthday money, how the bank would keep it safe and even pay him interest. "Think of it as planting a seed," Margaret said kindly to Tommy. "The more you save, the bigger your money tree will grow." David smiled approvingly. This was the kind of lesson Tommy needed to learn. Self-reliance, financial planning, building wealth systematically. These were the tools that separated successful people from those who ended up begging on street corners. As they completed the paperwork, David's mind wandered to his own journey. He had started with nothing, working 3 jobs while attending community college at night. He had sacrificed friendships, relationships, even time with family to build his business. Every dollar had been earned through sweat and determination. His ex-wife Sarah had never understood that drive. She had accused him of becoming cold, of caring more about money than people. Their marriage had ended 2 years ago when she claimed he had lost touch with his humanity. David had tried to explain that providing financial security for their family was the most loving thing he could do, but Sarah had walked away anyway. Now she lived across the country with her sister, calling Tommy once a week but showing no interest in rebuilding their relationship. David had won custody not through any legal battle, but simply because Sarah had chosen not to fight for it. She had said she needed time to find herself, whatever that meant. All finished, Margaret announced, handing Tommy a small booklet that represented his new savings account. "You're now officially a customer of First National Bank." Tommy took the booklet carefully, running his small fingers over the embossed cover. David felt a surge of paternal pride. This was how you taught children responsibility, by giving them real-world experience with financial institutions. As they prepared to leave, Tommy suddenly spoke up. "Papa, can we help that person outside?" David paused in gathering his papers. "What person?" "The one sitting by the wall. They look cold." David glanced out the window. The homeless person was still there, unmoving. He suppressed his annoyance at his son's misplaced compassion. "Tommy, there are organizations that help people like that," David explained patiently. "We pay taxes that fund social services. It's not our job to solve individual problems on the street." "But they're just sitting there," Tommy persisted. "Because they've made choices that led them there," David replied, his tone becoming more firm. "In America, everyone has opportunities if they're willing to work hard enough to take them." Margaret looked uncomfortable with the conversation, busying herself with filing papers. David realized he needed to wrap this up and get moving. He had a conference call with investors in 30 minutes. "Come on, son," David said, standing and extending his hand. "Let's go home. Maria is making your favorite lunch today." Tommy reluctantly took his father's hand, but, as they walked through the bank's lobby, David could see the boy's internal struggle. There was something about that homeless person that had captured Tommy's imagination, though David couldn't fathom what it might be. Outside, the morning sun had grown stronger, and the sidewalk was beginning to fill with pedestrians heading to work and tourists starting their day. David moved quickly toward his parked Mercedes, eager to get home and prepare for his calls. But, as they passed the corner where the homeless person sat, Tommy suddenly stopped walking. His small hand slipped from David's grip, and he turned to stare at the figure huddled against the wall. "Tommy," David called impatiently, not bothering to hide his frustration. "We need to go." The boy took a step closer to the homeless person, his young face filled with an expression David had never seen before. It was recognition mixed with disbelief, hope tangled with confusion. David felt his patience snap. He had indulged this fixation long enough. "Thomas Martinez," he said, using his son's full name in the tone that meant business was over. "Get back here right now." But Tommy didn't move. Instead, he took another step closer to the homeless person, his small voice barely audible above the city noise. "Excuse me," Tommy said softly. The figure didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, a dirty hand reached up and pushed back the worn baseball cap, revealing a face that was thin and weathered, marked by exhaustion and defeat. David was about to march over and physically collect his son when Tommy's next words stopped him cold. "Mama," the boy whispered, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. The homeless person's head snapped up, and David felt the world shift beneath his feet. Even beneath the grime and fatigue, even with her hair matted and her clothes torn, he recognized those eyes. The same green eyes that had once looked at him with love, that had sparkled when she laughed at his jokes, that had filled with tears the day she walked out of their home. Sarah Martinez sat on the cold sidewalk, staring at the sun she hadn't seen in over a year, while her ex-husband stood frozen on the marble steps of the bank, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The morning sun continued to shine, but, for David, the world had suddenly grown very dark indeed. Time seemed to stop on the busy sidewalk. Cars continued to rush past, people walked by absorbed in their phones, and the city hummed with its usual morning energy, but, for David, Sarah, and Tommy, the world had narrowed to this single moment of impossible recognition. Sarah's hand trembled as she pushed herself up from the cold concrete, her movements slow and careful like someone who had learned to expect pain. Her clothes, which David now realized might once have been a decent jacket and jeans, hung loose on her thin frame. Her face, once soft and full of laughter, was gaunt and marked by sleepless nights and worry lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. "Tommy?" Sarah's voice cracked, barely audible above the street noise. Her green eyes, the same ones that had captivated David 12 years ago at a coffee shop downtown, now brimmed with tears that she seemed afraid to let fall. Tommy stood perfectly still, his young mind trying to reconcile the mother in his memories with the woman before him. The mama who used to read him bedtime stories and make funny voices for all the characters. The mama who would dance with him in the kitchen while making breakfast. The mama who had hugged him tight the last time he saw her and promised she would call soon. "Mama," Tommy whispered again, and this time it wasn't a question. He rushed forward, wrapping his small arms around Sarah's waist with the desperate intensity of a child who had been waiting for this moment without even knowing it. Sarah collapsed to her knees, pulling her son close, burying her face in his dark hair that still smelled like the expensive shampoo from David's house. David watched this reunion from the bank steps, his mind reeling through 1,000 questions and emotions he couldn't name. How was this possible? How had Sarah, who had left to stay with her successful sister in California, ended up homeless on the streets of their city? How long had she been here? How many times had he walked past this corner without knowing? The practical part of his mind, the part that had built his business empire, immediately began calculating. He needed to control this situation. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. He needed to get them all somewhere private where he could understand what had happened and figure out how to handle it. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully controlled as he approached them. "We need to talk." She looked up at him over Tommy's head, and, for a moment, David saw a flash of the woman he had married. Behind the exhaustion and the fear, there was still that spark of independence that had both attracted and frustrated him during their marriage. "David," she said simply, as if they had seen each other yesterday instead of 14 months ago. "How long have you been?" He gestured vaguely at the corner, unable to say the word homeless out loud. "A while," Sarah replied, her arms still wrapped protectively around Tommy. The boy seemed unwilling to let go of her, as if afraid she might disappear again. David felt his phone buzzing in his pocket, reminding him of his conference call, his appointments, his carefully scheduled day that was now completely derailed. But, for the first time in years, he ignored it. "We can't discuss this here," he said, looking around at the growing number of curious passers-by. Some people were slowing down, obviously intrigued by the drama unfolding on the sidewalk. David's reputation in the business community couldn't afford speculation or gossip. "Papa, can Mama come home with us?" Tommy asked, his voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder but filled with hope. David felt trapped between his son's innocent wish and the complex reality of adult relationships. Sarah was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, part hope and part resignation, as if she was prepared for him to walk away. "Let's go get some coffee," David heard himself saying. "We need to figure this out." The nearest cafe was only 2 blocks away, a small family-owned place that David had never noticed despite walking past it hundreds of times. As they walked, Tommy positioned himself between his parents, holding both their hands, chattering excitedly as if this was a planned family outing. "Mama, I started 2nd grade. And I have a savings account now. And Papa bought me a new bike, and I learned to ride without training wheels." Sarah smiled at their son's enthusiasm, but David could see the pain in her eyes as she realized how much of Tommy's life she had missed. Each innocent update was like a small wound, a reminder of all the bedtime stories unread, all the scraped knees unkissed, all the proud moments unshared. Inside the cafe, David chose a corner booth where they could have privacy. He ordered coffee for himself and Sarah, hot chocolate for Tommy, and found himself studying his ex-wife's face as she listened to their son's continuing stream of updates. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were new lines around her eyes, but when she smiled at something Tommy said, David caught a glimpse of the woman who had once been the center of his world. Before success had consumed him. Before their marriage had become another item on his daily agenda. How did this happen, Sarah? David asked when Tommy paused to drink his hot chocolate. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. When she spoke, her voice was steady but tired. After I left, I stayed with Linda in San Francisco for a few months. But she was going through her own divorce, and her ex-husband was making things difficult. I couldn't find work there without a local address or references. Everything fell apart pretty quickly. David listened, trying to reconcile this story with his assumptions about what had happened after their divorce. He had imagined Sarah living comfortably with her sister, perhaps finding a new job, maybe even meeting someone new. He had never considered that she might be struggling. I came back to the city about 8 months ago, Sarah continued. I thought it would be easier to find work here, where I knew people. But... She trailed off, glancing at Tommy, who was absorbed in drawing pictures on his napkin with a crayon from the kids' activity box. But, what? David pressed. But 2 years is a long time in the job market. My skills were outdated. I didn't have current references. And every apartment I could afford required deposits I didn't have. I tried staying in shelters, but they're not safe, especially for women alone. Sleeping rough seemed like the safer option. David felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. Why didn't you call me? Sarah's laugh was bitter but not angry. What would I have said, David? That I had failed? That I couldn't make it on my own? You would have seen it as proof that you were right about everything. I would have helped, David said, though even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true. Would he have helped, or would he have seen her struggle as vindication of his belief that leaving had been her mistake? Would you? Sarah asked quietly. Or would you have used it as leverage for custody? Would you have helped, or would you have solved the problem by throwing money at it and expecting me to disappear again? David didn't answer because he wasn't sure of the answer. The man he had become might have done exactly what Sarah suggested. The thought disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Tommy looked up from his drawing. Mama, are you going to stay with us now? Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. I don't know, sweetheart. That's not up to me. David felt the weight of their expectant gazes. This moment would define their future, and he had no idea what the right decision was. His instinct was to control the situation, to find a logical solution that protected his interests and his son's stability. But, looking at Sarah's hopeful yet guarded expression, at Tommy's innocent faith that his family could simply come back together, David realized that some problems couldn't be solved with money or business strategies. You can't stay on the street, he said finally. I know, Sarah replied. But, I won't go to a shelter, and I won't take charity. It wouldn't be charity, David said, the words coming slowly as an idea formed. It would be temporary, until we figure out a permanent solution. You could stay in the guest room. For Tommy's sake. Sarah studied his face, looking for the catch, the condition, the price that would come with his offer. What would you expect in return? David hesitated. The honest answer was that he didn't know. Part of him wanted to set boundaries, to make rules that would protect him from getting hurt again. But, another part, a part he thought he had buried under years of business decisions and profit calculations, just wanted his family back. I expect you to get back on your feet, he said carefully. I expect you to be a mother to Tommy. And, I expect. He paused, unsure how to voice what he was feeling. What? Sarah asked. I expect us to figure out how to be adults about this, David finished. For his sake. Tommy beamed at them both, apparently convinced that his parents had just solved everything. Sarah looked uncertain but hopeful. And David felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the terrifying possibility that his carefully controlled life was about to become beautifully, chaotically complicated again. Outside the cafe windows, the city continued its relentless pace. But, inside their small corner booth, 3 people sat on the edge of a second chance, none of them quite sure if they were brave enough to take it. 3 months later, David stood in his kitchen making pancakes while Sarah packed Tommy's lunch for school. It wasn't the family scene he had once imagined, but it was something neither of them had dared to hope for when they sat in that cafe corner booth. the transition hadn't been easy. Those first weeks had been filled with awkward silences, careful politeness, and the complex dance of two adults trying to coexist while protecting themselves from further hurt. Sarah had insisted on sleeping in the guest room, maintaining boundaries that David sometimes wanted to cross but respected nonetheless. Tommy, of course, had adapted with the resilience of childhood. Having his mother back in the house had filled him with joy that was infectious, even during the most tense moments between his parents. He seemed determined to create a normal family life through sheer force of enthusiasm, dragging both parents into board games, movie nights, and bedtime story sessions. Sarah had found work within 2 weeks of moving in. Not the marketing position she had held before their marriage, but a job at a local nonprofit that helped families in crisis. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The pay was modest, but Sarah seemed to find purpose in helping others navigate the kind of challenges she had faced herself. "I understand what it's like to lose everything," she had told David one evening as they watched Tommy play in the backyard. "I understand how quickly life can change, how easy it is to fall through the cracks. I want to help people before they end up where I was." David had been surprised to discover that Sarah's struggles had changed her in ways that weren't just about loss. She was stronger now, more independent, less willing to let others make decisions for her. The woman who had left him had been seeking herself, and, while the journey had nearly destroyed her, she had apparently found what she was looking for. The business world, meanwhile, continued to demand David's attention. His empire hadn't crumbled during the family crisis, but he found himself approaching it differently. He was still driven, still successful, but something had shifted in his priorities. He had started a program at his dealerships to hire people who were getting back on their feet. Former addicts in recovery, people who had been homeless, individuals with gaps in their employment history. It wasn't charity, David made sure of that. These employees had to meet the same standards as everyone else. But he was willing to give chances that other employers might not. "You're becoming soft," his business partner Marcus had teased him one afternoon. "I'm becoming smart," David had replied. These employees are more loyal, work harder, and appreciate opportunities that other people take for granted. It's good business. But David knew it was more than business. Having Sarah back in his life, seeing what she had survived, had forced him to confront the man he had become during their marriage. Success had made him arrogant, convinced that anyone who struggled simply wasn't working hard enough. "David," Sarah said now, bringing him back to the present moment in the kitchen. Tommy's teacher called. "They want to meet with us this afternoon." David felt his old protective instincts flare up. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing bad," Sarah smiled. "He's been writing stories about family in his creative writing class. Apparently, they're quite good, and she wants to discuss entering him in a young writers' contest." David felt a surge of pride, followed immediately by gratitude. A year ago, if Tommy had been excelling at something, David would have been the only parent there to hear about it. Now, they could share these moments together. "We'll both go," he said, then paused. "If you want to, I mean. I don't want to assume." "David," Sarah interrupted gently. "We're his parents. Of course we'll both go." These small moments of normal family life still caught David off guard. He was still learning how to navigate this new dynamic, still figuring out what their relationship was and what it might become. They weren't a couple again, not in any romantic sense. They were co-parents, housemates, and slowly rebuilding friends. Sarah had made it clear that she wasn't looking to simply return to their old marriage, and David was discovering that he didn't want that either. They were different people now, shaped by loss and growth in ways that made their old patterns impossible to recreate. But there was something else growing between them, something neither of them had named or acknowledged. It was in the way Sarah laughed at David's terrible jokes while making dinner. It was in the way David found himself looking forward to their evening conversations after Tommy went to bed. It was in the careful way they were learning to trust each other again. That afternoon at the school, David watched Sarah talk with Tommy's teacher about their son's writing talent. She was animated in a way he hadn't seen during their marriage, confident and engaged. The experience of losing everything and rebuilding herself had given her a strength that was beautiful to witness. Tommy writes about how families can break apart and come back together in new ways, the teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was explaining. His understanding of complex emotions is remarkable for his age. This story he wrote about a father, mother, and son learning to love each other differently is quite sophisticated. David felt his throat tighten as he listened. Tommy's resilience throughout everything they had put him through was humbling. While his parents had been stumbling through adult complications, their son had been making sense of it all with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. Walking home from the school, with Tommy running ahead to chase fallen leaves and Sarah walking beside him, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the satisfaction of closing a business deal or achieving a financial goal, but the quiet happiness of being exactly where he belonged. "Sarah," he said quietly, so Tommy couldn't hear. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "I want to sell one of the dealerships." Sarah stopped walking, surprised. "Why?" "Because I want more time for this," David gestured toward Tommy, who was now trying to climb a small tree. "For family dinners and school conferences and Saturday morning pancakes. I've spent years building a business empire, but I almost missed out on watching our son grow up." Sarah studied his face. "You're sure? Your work has always been so important to you." "It still is," David said. "But it's not the only thing that's important anymore. I used to think providing financially was the same as being present. But watching you with Tommy these past months, seeing how much he needed you here, not just your support, I realize I've been confusing success with significance." They had reached their house, a beautiful colonial that David had bought to impress clients and colleagues. Now, as he looked at it, he saw something different. He saw Sarah's flowers in the front garden, planted during her second week back. He saw Tommy's bike on the front porch, and his chalk drawings on the sidewalk. He saw a home instead of just an asset. That evening, after Tommy was in bed, David and Sarah sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, something that had become their routine. These conversations had become the highlight of David's day, a chance to talk without the careful politeness they maintained in front of their son. "I've been thinking too," Sarah said, echoing his words from earlier. "About what?" "About why I really left." Sarah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I told myself it was because you cared more about money than people. But that wasn't entirely true." David waited, sensing this was important. "I left because I was afraid," Sarah continued. "Afraid that I was disappearing into your success, becoming just an accessory to your ambitions. I thought I needed to find myself somewhere else. But what I really needed was to find the courage to be myself right here." "And, did you? Find yourself, I mean." Sarah smiled. "I found more than I was looking for. I found out what I'm capable of surviving. I found out what really matters. And I found out that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you actually want to fight for." David set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. "What do you want to fight for now?" "This," Sarah said simply, gesturing between them and toward the house where Tommy slept. "But not the way it was before. Something new. Something better." David felt his heart speed up. "What would that look like?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I think we could figure it out together. If you want to." David reached for her hand, the first truly intimate gesture they had shared since she moved back in. Her fingers were warm, familiar yet different, marked by the experiences that had changed her. "I want to," he said quietly. "I want to build something with you that's about more than just security or success. I want to build something that's about love." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It won't be easy. We're different people now." "Good," David said. "The people we were before weren't wise enough to make it work." Inside the house, Tommy was dreaming about the family story he would write tomorrow, about second chances and new beginnings. Outside on the porch, his parents sat holding hands and planning a future that looked nothing like their past but everything like hope. The city continued its endless rhythm around them, full of people rushing toward their own dreams and struggles. Somewhere out there, other families were falling apart and coming back together. Other second chances were being offered and accepted or missed entirely. But, for David and Sarah Martinez, this moment was enough. This imperfect, complicated, beautiful chance to love each other better than before was exactly what they had been searching for all along, even when they didn't know that's what they needed. 6 months later, when David would walk past that same corner where he had first dismissed a beggar without a glance, he would stop and remember the day that changed everything. He would remember his son's wisdom, his ex-wife's courage, and his own journey from success to significance. And he would smile, grateful beyond measure for the moment when everything he thought he knew about his life was beautifully, permanently transformed by two simple words: "Papa, it's Mama."